Hello to everyone, and welcome as today we begin, as promised, to leave behind the office of President of the United States and the elections and the biographies and the first 100 days and begin a new section of lectures where we are going to consider a phenomenon that has really existed since the beginning of recorded history. Broadly speaking, the reasons why nations of people, states, at various times are highly incompatible with each other. Oftentimes, these adjacent countries are at war or states of near war, and recognize how today there are a number of combustible areas around the world that are sort of like tinderboxes where perhaps greater conflicts might begin. We've recognized again that throughout history there have always been tensions between places that were described as countries or states or nation states. Early on, the Spartans and the Athenians, now of course located in the state of Greece, were fierce rivals and fought conflicts against each other. Later, we would see Greece as a more unified country engage in a series of conflicts against its neighbor Persia over in the eastern parts of the Mediterranean. After that, as the Roman Empire began to proliferate throughout Europe and eventually across the Mediterranean into North Africa, Rome would engage in a series of conflicts against Carthage, and these Punic Wars would be notable for the ferocity of conflict among and between them. We move closer to modern times and recognize that even though beginning in the 16th century, much of Europe, and certainly Western Europe, was involved in the great exploration and colonizing of lands all around the world, there was a significant amount of conflict that occurred either in the European continent between countries like France and Prussia, Prussia and Russia, the Austrians often involved in these wars, and then later, after Germany was unified as a country, of course, a number of Franco-German wars. Oftentimes, Great Britain would find itself drawn into conflicts on the continent of Europe, a number of military campaigns necessary to finally defeat Napoleon. By the beginning of the 20th century, we would recognize that even though most of the crown heads of Europe were somehow related to each other, some very closely, that didn't prevent nationalistic tensions from putting much of Europe on the precipice of war. The Great War, of course, World War I, would begin in 1914, would last for more than 4 terrible years, even though the leaders of some of the primary antagonists in that conflict, Great Britain, Germany, and Russia, were very close relatives, all of them descendants of the former Queen Victoria of the UK. This horrible conflict, of course, was followed by the great Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 and 1919. And even though the peace was made in Paris in 1919, 20 years later, another horrible war began. Germany and France at conflict and odds with each other, and eventually there would be a significant European theater to that conflict. As World War II came to an end, we would see a new world order take shape, the notion of East versus West, and would see conflict through the broader prism of either the United States or the Soviet Union, typically backing different sides in different regional conflicts, in some respects perhaps creating caution that the US and the Soviet Union might go to war, but nonetheless always creating this possibility of a more horrific conflict ensuing. In Europe, in Asia, in the early 60s regarding Cuba, the Cold War brought the possibility of cataclysmic war closer to the fore. Now, by the late 1980s and the early 1990s, the Iron Curtain had fallen in Eastern Europe. Then the Soviet Union had broken apart. Russia possessed, and still does, a significant nuclear arsenal, but its conventional military capabilities began to decline. And for a period of time, the United States was indeed the world's only true superpower by most tests, and we would see a different face to regional conflict as it nonetheless began to occur all around the world. More recently, we've watched the ascendancy of China. Later this year, we'll talk a lot about China, but suffice it to say that in 2021, China is a country with significant national ambitions, no longer content to dominate and assimilate Tibet into the Chinese state. Now in the process of trying to do the same to Hong Kong, acting more menacingly across the Strait of Taiwan with the state of Taiwan, which China claims to be a breakaway state, and acting again very harshly to put down unrest in its western Xinjiang province, where the Uyghur population in particular has been subjected to significant restrictions by the Chinese government. China possesses a large army, a modernized navy, now larger than that of the United States, and possesses all kinds of nuclear capabilities in its own right. So as we examine over the next few months the Koreas, then the India-Pakistan region, then the Middle East, and finally when we look at Russia, yes, Russia, we're going to recognize that the United States and China are increasingly creating another Cold War-like environment where any tensions or any conflicts in any of these hot regions bode the possibility, presents the possibility of a broader conflict ensuing in the 21st century between the United States and the nation of China. Now today we are going to look at the Korean Peninsula and the great strife that has existed among and between North and South Korea almost from the time those two states were created in the aftermath of the defeat of Japan at the end of the Second World War. We recognize that Korea, if you look at the map, is a peninsula that juts off the northeast coast of Asia, sharing a very long border with China and a smaller border with Western Russia. Historically, the Chinese, the Koreans rather, as a nation of people, over thousands of years, managed to inhabit this peninsula and over time evolve a ethnic civilization that was quite separate and distinct from that of various neighbors in Eastern Asia. By the early 16th century, Korea had established a great Joseon dynasty, as it was known, and had come to embrace a neo-Confucius religious practice, established its own alphabet and culture, engaged in scientific advancements, including printing, meteorology, observation of the stars, utilizing calendar science, medicine, and agricultural science within its own borders. However, Korea always existed under the threat geographically and literally of various Chinese emperors seeking to expand their realm by reabsorbing the Korean people into their own state. By the 17th and 18th centuries, we would see Japan, the Japanese islands, of course, established a capability to travel across the Sea of Japan and at various times engage in hostilities with China, a little later with Russia, and always pose a threat to Korea itself. Recognizing by the 1880s and the 1890s that rising Japanese aggression in the region and the interests of China to greater protect its coastal areas against Japanese hostilities might eventually include conflict in Korea. By 1897, Korea had established itself as an autonomous, hermit-like state, and beginning in 1897, began to engage internally, again as this walled-off state, in modernizing its society, its economy, its property laws, engaging in more compulsory education for its citizenry, and entertaining Russia, France, the US, Great Britain, who were investing in Korea and eventually seeking to influence its politics. However, eventually, conflict would come close to Korea's borders. In 1904, the Russo-Japanese War would end by the intervention of American President Theodore Roosevelt, who would win the Nobel Peace Prize several years later for helping to bring an end to this conflict. And it would put Japan in a much stronger position to do what it eventually did in 1910. And that would constitute a physical invasion of Korea, the forced compliance by Korea's emperor to the Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty, beginning a Japanese occupation of Korea that would last from 1910 all the way until August of 1945, when Japan surrendered at the conclusion of World War II. During this period, the Korean language was suppressed in a Japanese effort to eradicate Korean identity. Koreans were forced to take Japanese surnames. Traditional Korean culture suffered heavy losses as numerous Korean cultural artifacts were either destroyed or taken to Japan, where still today many of these Korean artifacts, more than 100,000 of them, are either displayed in Japanese museums or are now held by private collectors. Japanese became the official state language spoken by government officials and written in Korean government public records. School children were educated in Japanese. The goal over time of the Japanese was to eradicate Korean ethnicity, eradicate Korean identity, and gradually, in the eyes of the Japanese, absorb the Korean population into a broader Japanese influenced region and absorb Koreans to become more Japanese in how they considered their ethnicity. This period of occupation would be noted by Korean resistance, much of it peaceful. Some young Koreans who had been Christianized during a period where missionaries traveled throughout Asia, attempting to introduce Christianity to various Asian peoples. Many Koreans would make their way outside of the country and would try to lead Western and European efforts to liberate Korea from Japanese control. One of the most important early Korean exile figures during this period of time would be a man named Syngman Rhee, who was a Christian educated in the United States, very much westernized, who would later come to play an important role following the end of World War II. In a movement known as the March 1st movement, seeking to remove Japanese occupation in Korea, in 1919, a peaceful gathering of Koreans was met by the Japanese military and police killing more than 7,000 peaceful Korean protesters. Initially, the Japanese had turned much of Korea into a labor colony. In the northern part of Korea, what is today North Korea, the Japanese located more heavy industry, more factories, built railroads, some of which are still in use in Korea today, and established Pyongyang as the important center of the Japanese domination of the Korean peninsula. As Japan, by the mid-1930s, had already occupied Manchuria in China and begun to do a lot of things to quote unquote, Japanize this part of the Chinese mainland, the Japanese were already making plans for a broader war. And to that end, it would mark a period where several 100,000 Koreans were relocated to the Japanese home islands in order to do work in building and maintaining a greater Japanese war industry. Throughout the course of the buildup and then the fighting of the Second World War, more than 5 million Koreans would be conscripted in one form or another to act and work on behalf of Japan. Hundreds of thousands of Korean men were forced into the Japanese military. More than 500,000 Koreans, again, were compelled into engage in forced labor on behalf of the Japanese government. And Korean women, along with Chinese women, were among the more than 200,000 women who were compelled to become sex slaves, or comfort women as they came to be known, for the Japanese military during the war years. Now, by the summer of 1945, Germany had already surrendered, and for most purposes, the war in Europe had come to an end. Nonetheless, in July of 1945, President Truman, along with Winston Churchill, traveled to Potsdam in occupied Germany in order to meet with Joseph Stalin, the ally of the United States and Great Britain, during the fighting in Europe in World War II. One of the main reasons for this gathering, July 1945, was to induce Stalin to do something that the Soviet Union had not yet done, that being to declare war on Japan, at a time when some still believed that the defeat of Japan would require the occupation, fighting, and physical defeat of the Japanese island by island by island. Only when Truman was at Potsdam meeting with Stalin did he receive word that the test of the first American-built nuclear device, the so-called Trinity test at Alamogordo in New Mexico, had been a success. And President Truman, of course, soon gave the orders for nuclear devices that had already been on their way to islands adjacent to Japan to be utilized. So August 6, 1945, Hiroshima is bombed. A device about 15 kilotons in power, used to devastate that Japanese city. On August 8th, 1945, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan, and then the following day, August 9th, a second American nuclear device was detonated over the Japanese city of Nagasaki. 5 days later, on August the 14th, 1945, Japan surrenders, and 10 days later, on August 24th, 1945, Soviet troops pour into the northern part of Korea and occupy Pyongyang, that more northern Korean city. So this very late entry into the Pacific theater of fighting by the Soviet Union gave it an opportunity to immediately occupy part of Korea in order to put into motion a plan that had been hatched by Stalin for the time when the fighting in the Pacific finally came to an end. In one of its first meaningful actions, the just created United Nations formally established on the Korean Peninsula a trusteeship administration of Korea as a prelude to eventual Korean elections. A northern trusteeship was put into the hands of the Soviet Union to administer the northern part of Korea, while the United States was given control of a southern Korean administrative zone, the 38th parallel of latitude being established as the border between the Soviet and American temporary administrative zones. until elections could be held. Obviously, elections that never took place. Because as this was occurring, in again this remote part of northeastern Asia, the Cold War was more quickly manifesting itself in Central and Eastern Europe. By 1948, the Soviet Union had managed to create and put in place Soviet-style governments with Soviet-backed leaders in Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and by 1948, Czechoslovakia as well. That Iron Curtain that had descended upon Europe at the end of World War II in 1945 was now a more hardened wall of separation. The efforts of the Soviets to perhaps move more deeply into Europe were eventually stymied. American military support, American economic support, the Marshall Plan most notably, and then the formalizing of a mutual defense organization, NATO, in 1949 would pretty much curb Soviet ambitions, which had been significant, to move more deeply into Europe. East Germany would sort of be the farthest the Soviets would get. Meanwhile, back in Korea, still by 1948, two separate temporary administrative zones, the Soviet Union put in place Kim Il-sung, a communist who had been living in exile for 26 years outside of Korea, who spent the World War II years in the Soviet Union learning more of the tenets of Bolshevism and I suspect Stalinism, preparing for the day when he would become the Soviets' man in the Korean Peninsula. By 1946 and 1947, Kim Il-sung had formed the Korean Communist Party and the Korean People's Army in the north. In the southern administrative zone, the United States eventually agreed, with a lot of debate and actually a lot of hesitation, that now 70-year-old Syngman Rhee, the great fighter in exile against the Japanese occupation of Korea, was the proper person to be the United States man in the southern occupation zone of Korea. Syngman Rhee was someone, again, American educated, Christian, autocratic authoritarian tendencies, but also, most importantly, virulently anti-communist in his political and economic beliefs. And soon, 70-year-old Syngman Rhee was flown to Seoul in October of 1945 as the most trusted leader in this southern occupation zone. So again, the years roll by, 1946, 1947. Kim becomes more entrenched, more in control in the north. Syngman Rhee more in control in the south. And then finally, on August 15th, 1948, Syngman Rhee declares the southern zone of Korea to now be the Autonomous Republic of Korea, the ROK, and less than a month later, on September 9th, 1948, Kim Il-sung declares the North to be the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, a separate, autonomous North Korean state. 1949 and 1950 would be critical years for the contours of how the Cold War would be fought, and ultimately a very critical year in the history of the relations between now these two separate Korean states. In April of 1949, the United States formalized the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, with again the implicit promise that any of our allies in Western Europe who were members of NATO agreed that an attack on one member would be an attack on all. In August of 1949, the Soviet Union, I think, surprised not just much of the world, but even much of the in-the-know scientific world by successfully detonating their first nuclear device. America's monopoly on the ability to build nuclear weapons and maintain a nuclear arsenal would last about exactly 4 years in duration. And then, a couple of months later, in early October of 1949, Mao Zedong would claim victory in an off and on more than 20-year-long Chinese Civil War as Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist government left the mainland for the island of Formosa to eventually become today's Taiwan, and Mao declared the People's Republic of China to be a brand new communist state, initially deriving a significant amount of support from the Soviet Union, and on geopolitical maps all around the world, China, like the much larger Soviet Union, soon became red. As the calendar turned to 1950, in January, significant events would occur both in the United States and throughout the world. For one, in January of 1950, suspicions that the only way the Soviet Union could have gained a nuclear capability as quickly as it did was by betrayal in the United States of America's nuclear secrets was seemingly confirmed when a physicist who had worked at Los Alamos by the name of Klaus Fuchs confessed to having provided nuclear secrets to a courier acting on behalf of a soon-to-be revealed network of spies in the United States. Over the next few months, this courier would be identified as a Brooklyn chemist by the name of Harry Gold, who would then be questioned and reveal that at Los Alamos there was another spy providing secrets, a man by the name of David Greenglass, who, when he was questioned by the FBI in May of 1950, would state that he was persuaded to spy by his brother-in-law, a Brooklyn engineer by the name of Julius Rosenberg. And soon this story of treachery was playing out in the headlines of American newspapers. Also in January of 1950, the accusations that China had been sold out, that somehow that China had been betrayed by perhaps sympathetic communist elements in America's government, were seemingly fortified when Alger Hiss in January of 1950 was convicted of several counts of perjury. Essentially, implicit in that verdict, the jury believed that Alger Hiss had been acting as a Soviet agent as he reached high parts of the United States State Department during the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s and the early 1940s. The temperature in the United States regarding the presence of Soviet spies, communists in our midst, would rise dramatically in just that 1 month, January of 1950. Now, on the other hand, America's Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, in January of 1950, delivered to the National Press Club a very critical speech in which he laid out what eventually would be known as America's containment strategy, the way in which the United States hoped over time, without a nuclear conflict, to limit the spread of Soviet communism, and eventually hope that that ideology would suffocate due to the lack of the human oxygen necessary to support and export an ideology such as Bolshevism. In his speech, Acheson went to great length to identify an American-enforced military defensive perimeter, speaking about areas in Europe, in the Middle East, in some parts of Asia, where the United States recognized Soviet influence had reached. The declaration of this perimeter was followed by an assertion that if the Soviets sought to increase its control beyond the contours of this perimeter, the United States would treat these incursions as a hostile act against ourselves. In this rather precise delineation of this defensive perimeter, for reasons that still today I don't clearly understand, Acheson omitted the 38th parallel of latitude, the border between the brand new states of North and South Korea. Was the omission just that, an omission, a mistake? Was the 38th parallel on a list in the speech that Acheson neglected to mention? Or, as Joseph Stalin might have inferred, Stalin still, of course, the primary backer and sponsor of Kim Il-sung, did this speech state that the 38th parallel of latitude between these two Koreas was something that the United States was not willing to go to war to maintain or to protect? Then in February of 1950, in Wheeling, West Virginia, Joseph McCarthy would of course give the notable speech where he asserted he had in his hand a list of so many communists that worked within the State Department, and we would then begin a period of ultra-heightened tension regarding communists in our midst and soon regarding actions being undertaken by countries backed and supported by the Soviet Union, most notably North Korea. On June 25th, 1950, North Korea launched a massive attack across the 38th parallel into South Korea. With tactical and logistical support from the Soviet Union, Kim Il-sung had promised that North Korean troops would control the entirety of the Korean peninsula by September of 1950, 4 or so months after the invasion. Something, by the way, that the North Koreans very nearly did. 2 days following the invasion, on June 27th, 1950, President Truman agreed that American troops would form the bulk of what was technically a United Nations police force, a police action having initially the goal of driving these North Korean invaders out of the South and back to their side of the 38th parallel. Initially, American troops stationed still in occupied Japan would be the first to arrive in the Korean theater of this conflict, and ultimately, American five-star general, World War II hero Douglas MacArthur would be placed under command of all United Nations troops. By early September of 1950, North Korean forces controlled all but a small area in and around the southeastern Korean port city of Pusan. And it was through the port in Pusan that the first numbers of American troops and UN troops, as well as war material, would make its way, because between August 4th and September 18th of 1950, the very fierce fighting in the Battle of the Pusan perimeter would be significant for finally stopping in its tracks the North Korean movement towards taking Pusan and thus occupying the entirety of Korea, and would reveal that in their very rapid movement southward, the North Koreans had very low quantities of supplies and very thin supply chains to continue to feed and arm and reinforce their troops. Then, of course, on September the 15th, at a beach at Incheon, located on Korea's west coast, just south of the 38th parallel, MacArthur engineered a textbook amphibious landing of American troops, meaning that North Korean troops fighting more southerly outside of Pusan were now in the threat of being caught in a vice. Those troops landing at Incheon, moving southward, troops moving out of Pusan in a more northerly fashion might trap the bulk of North Korea's army and perhaps bring about a more rapid end to the conflict. The North Korean army between September 15th and early November of 1950 would engage in a disorganized, rapid, hasty retreat out of the Pusan area, eventually out of South Korea entirely into the north. And by November of 1950, UN troops had not only chased the North Koreans out of South Korea, they chased much of their army into the most northerly parts of South Korea, some actually crossing the Yalu River into China. UN troops would take constructive control of Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, and would make their way, UN troops would, read as American troops by the Chinese, to within a few miles of the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China itself. Now, by this time, given that Joseph Stalin and Mao fell out almost as soon as the communist Chinese had claimed control of the mainland, and given that China shared a much longer border with North Korea than did Russia, China would eventually and rapidly, really, become the primary booster, the primary backer of Kim Il-sung in North Korea during the remainder of the war. Now, as the war began, with the benefit of hindsight, political scientists have recognized the critical decisions that President Truman had to make almost as soon as North Korea invaded the South on June 25th, 1950. Truman would later write that the decision to send American troops to fight on the Korean Peninsula was the most difficult decision he would have to make during his presidency, asserting that the decision to use nuclear weapons against Japan was a much more easy and straightforward one. The first decision, of course, was to use American troops and to permit American troops to be part again of this larger United Nations police action. Now in reality, American troops' ground forces constituted more than half of the troops that the United Nations as an entity would commit to the fight in Korea. The United States Navy would provide almost 90% of all of the UN's naval forces, and the United States Air Force would provide almost all of the air support and air attacks that the UN policed Navy, Air Force would engage in during the conflict. So the first decision, of course, would answer in the affirmative. The United States was in. The second decision came pretty rapidly in September and October of 1950, that being the question of whether or not U.S. troops would actually travel from South Korea into North Korea in order to engage in hot pursuit of the North Korean army. And of course, we know President Truman answered that question in the affirmative as well. The third question was a request from General MacArthur to permit UN troops, again, read that as primarily American and South Korean troops, to cross from North Korea over the Yalu River into China, in part to further take on North Korean forces that had taken haven in China, but also hearing from a very powerful China lobby in the United States to perhaps do the job of liberating the mainland from communist control, ridding it of Mao, and perhaps providing a way to bring Chiang Kai-shek back to the mainland. MacArthur even talking at times of the tactical use of small nuclear weapons to defeat the Chinese. The answer from President Truman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff to this request was a loud and clear no. Now, ultimately, Mao Zedong, in power in the mainland for just about a year, remember, October of 1949 was when he declared victory in the Chinese Civil War, ultimately viewed this massing of hostile forces so close to China's borders as a threat to himself, to the Chinese Communist Party. So when eventually in November of 1950, a North Korean counterattack ensued, it would be a counterattack supplemented by, at the time, more than 1 million Chinese troops, some unarmed, some barely armed, some barefoot, and eventually, during the remainder of the conflict, the best guess is that more than 5 million Chinese troops found their way, one way or another, into the fighting that remained in the Korean conflict. By early 1951, incompatibility between President Truman and Douglas MacArthur became more public and more obvious. And in April of 1951, Truman essentially fired MacArthur as the commander of UN troops, called him home. MacArthur would later give that year his famous speech to a joint session of Congress, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." Later, Truman would comment very caustically and profanely about MacArthur. He said that he did not fire Douglas MacArthur because he was a dumb SOB, because Truman said if that were the law, 3/4 of generals would probably lose their jobs. He said he fired MacArthur because he would not respect the separation between the military and the president as America's civilian commander-in-chief. So for the next 2.5 years, the war would be fought largely in what is today in North Korea, in some of the coldest and geographically inhospitable places for modern-style war to be waged. That part of North Korea, very mountainous, few paved roads, few railroads, deathly cold in the evenings, was again a godforsaken place to fight the last 2 years of a conflict. The historian David Halberstam, now about 15 years ago, in the last major work he published before his untimely death, wrote a magnificent history. It's on one of those shelves over there. Now that I see it, I should have had it somewhere here to use. Here it is actually, entitled "The Coldest Winter." Anyone with any Korean conflict experience or any interest in the subject, I highly recommend this book as a comprehensive history of American involvement in Korea and the Cold War circumstances that made our involvement there so necessary. So finally, after fighting that would eventually take the lives of 34,000 American troops, more than 800,000 South Korean troops, 600,000 or 700,000, the numbers here are inexact, North Korean military members, and perhaps 1.5 to 2 million Chinese. On July 27th, 1953, all parties agreed to an armistice, an agreement to stop fighting. July 27th, 1953, bringing the fighting part of this conflict to an end after a little more than 3 years, although no formal peace treaty ending that conflict has ever been agreed to, much less signed. So 68 years later, that armistice, that agreement to stop fighting, has held. Cruelly, the armistice created a border that today is just slightly north of the 38th parallel, the border between the two Koreas when the conflict began. And we know, of course, that following the end of the fighting, the border between North and South Korea became one of the most heavily militarized places on Earth. Ground troops, artillery pieces. For a time, the United States maintained tactical nuclear weapons in the South. Prior to the 9/11 attacks, which of course caused us to reassess our defensive priorities and relocate a lot of our military forces elsewhere, prior to 9/11, there were at times 100,000 American troops stationed on the South Korean side of this border. 9/11 would see us again ramp down our number of troops. And then during the Trump administration, as President Trump drove, again, his America First policy to, in some respects, cause us to less commit to things like a heavy troop presence in South Korea, the numbers would fall even more. Now, since that armistice was signed all the way into the present time, if some diabolical genius, some mad scientist had said, we're going to create a great social experiment. We're going to take a group of people that in their DNA and in their ethnicity are all the same. They are all of the same nationality. We're going to separate them into two diametrically different states with different governments, different opportunities, different economic and political models, and then sit back to try to create the two most completely different populations as possible. Had that been planned, what today is North Korea and South Korea would be the result. A nation of people, ethnically, genetically Korean, living in two diametrically polar opposite states. Today, the state of North Korea possesses a population of about 26 million people, while South Korea's population is nearly double, about 51 million. South Korea, in the years following the end of the conflict, did exist as an authoritarian state, Syngman Rhee holding on to power into the 1960s. From the 1960s into the 1990s, South Korea would attempt to create a constitutional democratic state, going through the early steps of a constitution being written, elections being held, leaders taking office, and then doing things that displeased what was the most powerful institution in South Korea, the military, often resulting in leaders being deposed, taken out of office, not having their deposition taken, military men filling in for a time, constitutions being revised, elections being held, leaders displeasing the military, a cycle that would come to an end in the 1990s, so that today South Korea is a fully transparent democratic state whose citizens are guaranteed the rights that countries in Western liberal democracies enjoy. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to form political parties and seek elective office. Religious freedom is abounding today in South Korea. Christianity enjoying some of its fastest growth in South Korea. And of course, economically, South Korea has been one of the great economic miracles in the post-World War II world. The Economist magazine once described it as having gone from a barefoot country to a country that had the greatest penetration of broadband, barefoot to broadband, in a period of less than 40 years. South Korea possesses one of the most highly educated populations anywhere in the world, a great emphasis in science and industry and technology, a younger population, heavily pressured, heavily stressed out for that one day every year where nationwide exams determine which level of university that young South Korean can attend, knowing that still today in South Korea, those who graduate from the highest level of universities occupy the highest level of jobs in that country's society. Lower levels gravitate to less important jobs, so that the stress level on South Korean students today is on the one hand sad and troubling, but on the other hand, especially if you have young kids you're raising, the idea that South Koreans attend school, that a school day is 10 hours long, they attend school year-round, and most students with the highest aspirations and families that are able to do so often have tutors who then spend time with their children after the school day has come to an end. South Korea has built some of the most notable and prominent industrial conglomerates, so-called chaebol as they're known, that have a presence all around the world. Samsung, Hyundai, Daewoo, Kia, LG, just to name a few. On the other hand, North Korea is today even notable among repressive regimes around the world for being in a league of its own, an anomaly in the nature of how this hermetically sealed hermit kingdom has built one of the greatest Stalinist totalitarian governments that exists anywhere in the world today. One has rolled, the snake eyes of life to find themselves born in North Korea. A totalitarian state where every aspect of a citizen's life is dominated and controlled by the North Korean state, a state that's built upon a fraud, a bill of goods, a fraud that can only be sold to a North Korean people that live in a world where no outside information, no news, no internet exists, can be accessed except by the very highest echelons of North Korean society. The fraud, of course, upon which ultimately North Korea's government is built is a cult of personality surrounding the Kim family. Kim Il-sung, the founder of the North Korean state, was born into a Christianized Presbyterian family and then left Korea following the Japanese invasion. When he returned in 1945, and then following the end of the Korean conflict, the mythology of Kim Il-sung being born atop a sacred mountain in Korean culture under a double rainbow that had formed to announce his birth would again mark the beginning of this scam that the Kim family has perpetrated now upon 26 million people. Kim Il-sung, the great leader, the eternal leader of the North Korean state, and the man who would create North Korea's great dependence on China, on China's largesse. As we're going to see, he put in place policies that made North Korea an isolated state vis-a-vis the rest of the world. When Kim Il-sung died in 1994, his son Kim Jong-il, the dear leader as he would be known, succeeded him. Kim Jong-il had the same highly mythological story of his birth written about him. Kim Jong-il had actually been born in 1941 in the Soviet Union when his father was living there. And in Soviet records, Kim Jong-il was christened Yuri Ursenovich Kim. Succeeding his father, Kim Jong-il would have stories propounded upon him. For instance, stories about his great athletic prowess. It was said that the very first time Kim Jong-il played the game of bowling, he rolled a perfect score of 300. When he first played the decadent game of golf, he mastered it, shooting a score 38 under par with 5 holes in one. Only to a population that doesn't have the ability to contextualize these statements can these bald-faced assertions be made. Kim Jong-il became sick late in life, as most do. and around 2009 anointed one of his sons, a younger son, Kim Jong Un, to succeed him. Kim Jong Un was born somewhere between, this is how little is known, 1982 and 1984. He's in his late 30s today. Was educated part of his life in a boarding school in Switzerland. Was made a marshal in the North Korean army by his father, soon Kim Jong-un, known as the Young Marshal. And then when Kim Jong-il died in 2011, 10 years ago nearly, Kim Jong-un became the third member of the Kim family to run North Korea. The Kim family would establish principles that North Koreans still live their lives by today. One is the concept of Juche, Juche, which means self-reliance. Never again would North Korea be at the mercy, even though it is with China, of a foreign state. Juche communicated an independent stand, an independent spirit, and self-reliance. In the 1990s, Kim Jong-il established the principle of Songjun because so many countries coveted, occupying, and dominated North Korea, even though times would be hard. And in the late 1990s, there would be a famine in which perhaps as many as 2 million North Koreans starved. Songjun put forth the theory of military first, this concept of sacrifice so that a strong military could protect the North Korean state. We've seen as a hallmark of life in North Korea an unreliable food supply since the ending of the conflict. Little heavy industry or manufacturing, very primitive industries, mining, a source of foreign capital. Sporadic generation of electrical power. I didn't have it on this handout, but the famous picture of a satellite image of the Korean Peninsula at night shows all of South Korea brightly lit, and then where North Korea begins, only tiny flickers of light near Pyongyang. Not enough consistent electrical power in North Korea even today. An established system of internal prisons, gulags, where at any one time hundreds of thousands of North Koreans might be toiling. Maybe you were not sufficiently sad at one of the Kim's family's deaths. Maybe you didn't march properly in a military parade. Maybe one of the members of your family managed to make their way out of North Korea northward into China, or tried to. You would then be marked as unreliable and usually spend the rest of your life in one of these gulags. Its population, again, entirely disconnected from the outside world. Only the elite of the elite have internet. And increasingly, a rogue criminal regime. This mafia analogy, again, still relevant. For a time, North Korea had mastered the counterfeiting of American $100 bills to the point where the Treasury Department would have to redesign our currency, but in particular $100 bills, to make them harder to replicate. For a time, North Korea was a massive manufacturer and trafficker in methamphetamine, setting up distribution networks around the world. in order to draw Western currency into the state. Today, North Korea is considered to have among the best army of computer hackers anywhere in the world. The United States is great. China's is good. North Korea's ability to engage in cyber theft and in cyber espionage is considered to be on par with that of Russia. If you have access to the New Yorker magazine, a recent article talked about how in the last several years, North Korean hackers have stolen billions of dollars from hacking into the computer systems of large banks around the world, and how last year North Korean hackers stole perhaps $1.5 billion worth of Bitcoin from one of the central online repositories where Bitcoin is stashed. North Korea has one of the world's largest standing army, one of the top 4 in the world, 1.5 million active duty, 6 million in reserve. North Korea has 20,000 conventional artillery pieces along its border with South Korea, able to strike Seoul, the South Korean capital, whose population is nearly, today, 20 million. Bizarre behavior. In 1968, taking possession of the USS Pueblo, holding its crew for nearly a year from January to November of 1968. The crew of the Pueblo returned to the United States. The Pueblo today is a North Korean museum of how Kim Il-sung defeated these dastardly Americans seeking again to intrude into North Korean space. And to a very concerned world, North Korea today possesses the capability of building and miniaturizing nuclear weapons and has built and tested missiles, most recently intercontinental ballistic missiles, multi-stage rockets, able to deliver a warhead, in theory, up to 8,000 miles away, putting all of the United States in the theoretical range of one of these missiles. So the nuclear club has grown since 1945. The United States, the Soviet Union, then Britain, France in the 1950s. In the 1960s, China, and then almost certainly, although it hasn't been formally admitted, Israel developed nuclear capabilities. That's 7. In 1997, within the span of a few weeks, the subjects of our lecture next month, India and Pakistan joined the nuclear club. And then in 2006, North Korea detonated its first test nuclear device. While Iran aspires to be a nuclear power, maybe the Saudis, maybe Turkey, no potential nuclear power has a leadership structure close to being as irrational as Kim Jong Un, the leader of the North Korean state. It is thought that North Korea today, possesses 60 nuclear-tipped missiles of various capabilities of flight. Since 1994, North Korea has conducted more than 150 missile tests. More than half of them, more than 80 of them, have taken place in the last 10 years during the leadership of Kim Jong Un. Most recently, again, these intercontinental ballistic missiles. It is believed that North Korea has miniaturized nuclear devices that in 2016 were thought to be measured by outside experts in the 10 to 30 kiloton range of power. If it's 30 kilotons, it is twice the power of the Hiroshima nuclear device. However, in 2017, when North Korea conducted its last significant underground test, which North Korea asserted was the test of a thermonuclear device, a much more sophisticated and much more powerful device. The power of that device was measured to be in a range between 100 and 250 kilotons of explosive power, an enormous device. North Korea has recently test fired from a submarine, a missile it claims can be fitted with a nuclear device as well. The missiles that North Korea displays at military parades that it holds from time to time range from the Hwasong-12 that has a capability of traveling 2,800 miles to the Hwasong-14, again a range of about 5,000 miles, an ICBM, and then the most recent, the Hwasong-15, a range of 8,000 miles, again in theory, capable of striking anywhere in the United States. North Korea uses its missile testing and its underground detonations as a way to destabilize its part of the world and by extension the United States. North Korea still maintains a very hostile relationship with Japan, politically very hostile relations with the South, and views, of course, the United States as the world power that backs both of these two adversaries. Prior to China becoming the economic powerhouse that it is today, and the world's great exporter, and now a country that wants to be seen as one that is diplomatically and economically and philanthropically one on par with the United States, the Chinese government sort of used North Korea as its attack dog, as its way of laughing at other places in Asia like Taiwan and Singapore and Malaysia and Japan and South Korea, the so-called Asian tigers that had been so economically productive. No better way to disrupt the region than to have North Korea conduct a missile test or maybe even detonate a device. Until now, China is faced with the conundrum that North Korea is no longer its, Rottweiler on a leash, but is now more perhaps a Frankenstein monster that China helped create. China must, to a certain extent, support economically, via food, and even to an extent militarily, North Korea. It works very hard to prop up the Kim regime because a collapse of the Kim government would create a humanitarian catastrophe for China as 26 million North Koreans suddenly try to move northward from North Korea into China, a border that China guards very heavily. South Korea has resolved itself to not realistically envisioning any reunification of Korea as one state. They saw the costs that West Germany had to incur when Germany was reunified through the 1990s, but has promised to build a stronger state, a more humane state, and a more friendly state in what might be one day a post-Kim family North Korea. American governments, of course, have used different strategies to deal with North Korea. President Clinton, food, energy, medicine in exchange for less aggressive North Korean missile testing. The Bush administration, after President Bush identified North Korea as one of the three axes of evil in 2001, Kim Jong-il used that speech to accelerate missile building and to accelerate the building of nuclear devices. The first successful detonation of a North Korean nuclear device took place in the second Bush term in 2006. President Obama, very coolly for 8 years, engaging in strategic patience with North Korea. Maybe the carrot and the stick, sanctions versus food aid, medicinal aid, the cessation of war games would keep North Korea's nuclear saber rattling under control. President Trump built a personal relationship with Kim Jong Un, meeting with him 3 times in historic summit meetings, describing the two of them as having, quote, fallen in love, exchanging love letters, in the hope that Kim Jong Un would give up all of North Korea's nuclear capability in exchange for American aid eventually and the elimination of economic sanctions on North Korea. Was Kim Jong Un ever serious about doing this? Or was this just another stalling tactic? North Korea now, again, has an arsenal, we believe, of at least 60 nuclear-tipped missiles. Who knows? But that strategy only resulted in the Trump administration increasing sanctions on North Korea. President Biden came into office in a recent speech before Congress, describing the North Korean situation as one that he is determined to get under control. Kim Jong-un better watch out. And on May the 2nd, Kim Jong-un rolled out rhetoric. The words of President Biden create a very grave situation, which may manifest itself in some North Korean action soon. Maybe another nuclear detonation, maybe the testing of another missile, but the game with the Kim family goes on. South Korea and Japan, heartened, I believe, by the Biden administration looking once again to regional cooperation and solutions to the issue. China sitting back, again, wondering how to keep in line this Frankenstein monster that it created, perhaps knowing full well that North Korea is a state synonymous with Kim family control, and the Kims now have the ultimate deterrent if they are willing to utilize these nuclear devices in the event the Kims see themselves falling as the leaders of this North Korean state. So, thank you for joining us. And when we meet again in this series, we are going to move on to another issue associated again with this worldwide tension and contention, and another installment in the series, Why Can't We Be Friends? Thank you, and have a very nice rest of the day.